Hi all, an exciting World Chess Championship. Let's have a look at round 10, so game 10. Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces. E4 for Magnus. E5, we enter the classic Ruy Lopez, and here is the Berlin defense. Now, Magnus chooses actually D3. He wants to avoid that main line variation of the Berlin, which goes like this, castling, and we get this endgame, which is very much trendy in recent years since Kramnik defeated Kasparov in a World Chess Championship match, neutralizing Kasparov multiple times with the black pieces. So the dreaded Berlin endgame position here is avoided by playing this move D3. So we now have bishop c5, c3. This is avoiding the kind of very mainline castling, so it's waiting for black to castle and not committing the king just yet. Bishop g5, and this is an annoying pin potentially, which black needs to be concerned with. Now h6 is played, and you might think after bishop h4 there might be a temptation for something like g5. It's very committal, but in fact it has been played before, g5, but in this game we see bishop e7. There's actually quite a high level game with g5, which went like this: bishop g3, d6, knight bd2, and you'll note white hasn't castled yet. a6. This actually occurred in Anand against Topalov in 2005, which ended in a draw. Game went on from there. They didn't agree to draw there, by the way. Okay, so anyway, in this position though, instead of that quite committal g5, because it does weaken some light squares, we have bishop e7, which seems a natural way of unpinning, and also provides black tactics sometimes if white's not careful with this bishop and this battery on h4. White castles here. You might think, hold on a sec, wasn't there an opportunity to win a pawn? This is very, very dubious, this position, for winning a pawn, that is. Black can just take with the b pawn, and gobble up that bishop pair, ready to support e5 soon. The thing is, if white tries to win e5 here, can you see what black can play? If I give you 5 seconds. Yeah, knight takes e4 is possible here, and this is just not very good for white. If he takes him on the knight. If here we take here, it's not very good for white. So there isn't a way of winning a pawn here. We see just castling now. So white's actually now committed to castling. You'll note in other games, which some of the draws, we noted that both sides kind of mimicked each other. Castling was quite often from both sides, but here there's quite a delay on white castling. We see d6. Now knight bd2. Yeah, white's not interested in doubling the pawns here. This bishop, can come back sometimes. We see knight h5, wanting to exchange off these bishops. Now, I think it's pointless to play bishop g3 because black can just gobble up that dot square bishop, and this could be quite useful later on. So actually, white plays bishop takes e7. You'll notice this is a loose piece at the moment, and loose pieces are potentially tactically kind of liabilities, and you see that there might be at some point the possibility of something like taking. Not here though, and in fact even on the previous go, by the way, when knight h5, sorry, after knight h5, okay, no, actually this position, bishop takes e7. Instead of queen takes e7, based on this piece here, you might think knight takes e7 is a mistake. Actually, it's not entirely. After knight takes e5, knight f4, and when this knight moves back, a6, and you'll see that d3 is actually weak here. Because if the bishop moves, we can kick the bishop again and win d3 after the bishop goes here. We just tell d3. So it's not a big deal that knight in this position, even if knight takes e7 was played. Not yet a big deal. Okay, so we have queen takes e7, but bear it in mind, knight c4. Karpov once lost the game very, very quickly to Larry Christensen, by the way, who was one of my ICC commentators on an earlier round, where Karpov lost in less than 15 moves. He had a loose piece, which was double attacked. I think it was actually a knight on h5, a classic game. Check out Christensen against Anatoly Karpov, classic game. Anyway, so here there is a dangerous loose piece in the position, but it's not fatal yet. It's not fatal. This usually has the idea of swinging to e3 to look at these light squares. Now, in fact, this is potentially threatened after this. There is potentially the idea of taking here and then taking here, because the queen can't take back. Before it might have, but now with both knights going up on e5, this will expose an attack on h5. Yeah, you see in this position, knight takes e5, there's queen takes e5, protects the h5 knight. But after this, yeah, this is actually on the cards to take on e5 potentially. Well, after taking on c6, to take here, and then we're on this knight. Finally, this knight secures itself, though. We see knight f4, so it goes out of trouble zone. And it's actually kind of handy here on f4. Also, by the way, on rook e8, I think we have the same kind of principle. We have knight f takes e5. So it takes, actually we can just take here first, and then we take there. So, okay, the knight secures itself. I mean, it seems a very, very logical move to just go to safety. No loose pieces now, for the moment, from either side. Except for this one, you can argue that's not protected by anything. We have knight e3. So white has nice light square control here. But this looks like something you want to kick away, really. It's an aggressive piece. And it's reinforced, actually, with queen f6. But now it is kicked. And you might think, hold on, what about doubling the pawns? That's always, it's not as clear cut as just fracturing the structure. There's always an upside for the opponent. Yeah, and this is actually technically quite good for black, this position. So you might have thought this is one of the ideas, but it's not a key one here. g3 is played instead. Check. Now the king, you might think going to g2, but actually it goes to h1. It's a bit safer sometimes on h1. On the other hand, that f3 is a bit of a looser piece, liability here. It could be in some variations. We see how now this knight can go to g6, knight e7. You might think, well, doesn't that leave that bishop looking a bit silly? It kind of did what it set out to achieve earlier, but now it can retreat back and be annoying on this diagonal. We see c6. Okay, bishop b3, knight g6. Queen e2, so the queen sticks around, has to protect f3 of course, and it's also guarding f2 now as well. So these two are solid at the moment. a5, and now you might think a move like a3 could be considered. a4 is actually preventing also b5 as well as giving the bishop another square potentially to use. We see now bishop e6, and this is a really curious point of the game. And for me, it's kind of evidence that maybe both players are getting a little bit tired. Because what happens now is a little bit strange. Remember, this is game 10 of 12. White just needs a draw. And Magnus plays actually bishop takes e6. Now, ordinarily, I would say about such a move in other games, on general principles, it's an interesting trade-off because you're giving black double pawns, but they're controlling central squares, you know, like d5, and there's f-file pressure. But here, very concretely, there's evidence this is actually potentially very, very good news for black immediately, let alone long-term considerations. On the upside for white, maybe these pawns could later be undermined easily, more easily rather. But here, there's an immediate upside. Instead of taking with the queen, we have f takes, yeah, supporting d5, and the battery is immediately created, hitting the knight, which is now loose. And this is really controversial now, because after knight d2, maybe intuitively Magnus felt knight takes f2 is unplayable in doing knight fd2, or this whole thing with bishop takes e6. And actually black played d5 here, but actually it turns out, before we go into d5, believe it or not, that knight takes f2 is playable. And some GMs around the internet think this might have been some sort of deep trap. But actually, in the post-match interview, Magnus just fluffed up, basically, in allowing this. There's an enormous tactical opportunity here. Now, on king g2, there's an immediate draw available for black on king g2. Can you see what black can play if I give you 5 seconds starting from now? Okay, yeah, knight h4 check forces a draw, because if taking, there's check, and that's just better for black. The knight's controlling h1 and g4 is no good, this position. So actually, given that's the case, that's bad, what we get is a perpetual here, check, and just perpetual with the check here. Because if white tries to play rook takes f2, he has to go back for this check. Then white just ends up worse, because the d2 knight is hanging here. This is just worse for white, as the exchange date is lost. Now, the other curious thing about this, why some might have thought of this as a trap, is actually after knight f2, there's also king g1. So not going into this knight h4. And off the check, actually, we get this idea that actually we can play king g2 here. But this variation, technically, if you run it through computers at least, and unless Magnus Carlsen is bluffing, this should be better for black with this check. So we're forking queen and king. I think equally the other one could be used. The point is, taking, we get an imbalanced position, but engine evaluation is better for black here, and the pawn potential is with black here. I'll give you an example, a fictional continuation. You can see that the pawns, Philidor would love, the pawns of the solar chess, he would love this position because the pawns have got potential. But yeah, some might argue, well, this is kind of imbalanced. Sorry, just showing this light. It's kind of imbalanced, as if, I don't believe so. I just think this is better for black, this particular position, this type of scenario. The pawns have got great gravity here. So in other words, basically, to sum up here, it seems knight takes f2 is really on the cards and maybe should have been played, because Sergey only needed a draw, so he didn't play this. It's very, very curious position within the game. Very, very curious why knight takes f2 wouldn't have been played. Yeah, so anyway, d5, and funny enough, after queen h5, again, we get knight f2 again as possible, which could have been good. Instead, black played knight g5, and I'm starting to think Sergey must be really knackered or something. He's not calculating these forcing moves. Generally, I think everyone agrees, all humans agree about chess calculation. We should really prioritize our, when we calculate forcing moves, because I know we're like terrible compared to computers, but at least in forcing moves, we're cutting down the tree. The trees are not so complex. But here, knight takes f2 is a forcing move. After king g2, there's another great forcing move. Here, queen f7, threatening knight f4 check, because otherwise white will have time to play knight g4, and this looks really ridiculous to go into this self pin, in the light of knight g4. But the thing is, queen f7 means knight f4 to win the queen. And what happens here if king g1, queen f6? And the thing is, if there's no time to do anything else, because knight g4, there's queen g5. This is a forcing of hitting the queen. It's using the queen as an unprotected piece, because after takes, then the knight escapes in the nick of time with knight h3 check. It's incredible stuff. I mean, but it is based on forcing moves, which seem to be just in black's favour here. e5 is not dropping off here that easily. Black is good here. So yeah, this is the second time in this game where black could have kind of snatched a draw. If we look at this position now, let's also look at king g1 here. There's an immediate queen g5 forcing move here, which now you might think, okay, if the queen moves back, we just escape. I believe we just escape with knight h3. Actually, I'm just going to add a bit. So I have done a bit of preparation on this guy, but I'm just going to add another bit of layer to this analysis. If I can, maybe I can't. Pardon me. Yeah, just knight h3 here. So the g2 square can't be used, and here we just go back with knight f2. So it's as simple as that actually. Let's turn it off. So yeah, this is the second time in the game, and this is even clearer than the other one because there's no dynamic imbalanced position. It gives me a slight evidence that I think the players are both tired. They have been through some marathon games already. Chess is mental work. So anyway, d5 was played. Queen h5, just to go back to this position where knight f2, but instead we just see knight g5. So there's been two opportunities already where Sergey, he's leading the match, and this is the 10th game out of 12. He could have potentially secured a draw from both opportunities. So I'm thinking he's tired a bit. So it's good news for Magnus here. That game's still in progress. We have now a forcing move here, h4, which might not actually be even great news, although Magnus might have wanted an endgame scenario, because this e5 is actually potentially one of the points of queen h5 is to put pressure here, and h4 is very forcing actually, because if the knight retreats back, I think there's some dangerous possibilities on e5. Actually, let's check this position. If the knight retreats back, knight g4, we're on e5. And actually, I think we might even be able to nick that pawn and live to tell the tale here. Yeah. So, this is why this does seem to force simplification. That knight f3 might be better for black as the game. But it turns out, here, instead of h4 as played, there's also just another way of putting pressure on e5, which might technically be stronger. With the idea of knight g4 coming up, just using that queen as an important tempo gainer. And we've got ed, we've got loads of pressure on e5 coming up. Now if knight f3 here, yeah, it's a very, very interesting position. So on knight g4, then queen g5 is possible again. That rescues the knight just in time and uses that queen again as a tactical liability. So this position, though, after rook a e1, so knight f3, there is actually, sorry, I know queen g5 does rescue the situation, it seems, hitting the queen, but after queen takes, here black is going to be losing a pawn if taking with the knight. It has to keep hold of e5. So on hg we have double pawns there, and now we've got the original set of double pawns, so we've got two sets of double pawns in this scenario, all based on this e5 being loose, which was one of the ideas of playing queen h5 earlier to hit e5. And rook d1, this is better for white technically than Magnus's move. This is also simplification. This position is better. So basically, yeah, there seems to be an extremely strong move instead of h4 that was played. So in this position, Magnus has played h4, but yeah, engines suggest that there's a way of subtly putting more pressure on e5 by playing rook a e1. I'm just going to get a cross check as well. I think rook a e1, it's a subtle move, but it's kind of invisible threats. Not so invisible by g4. It forks queen and the pawn. Yeah, it's dangerous for black after this. Okay, but anyway, h4. We get this transition now into kind of endgame. King g2. Now, if the rooks try and protect like this, I think there's just knight f5 here without having to check this out. It protects, the protection's interrupted. So I think we can just nick that rook. So I don't think that's a good idea. So the rook's evicted. Rook fe1. There's pressure indirectly now on e5. We see h5, because actually another aspect to this is undermining the defender of e5 with h5. So actually this is kind of threatened. But, and you might ask, well, why wasn't h5 played immediately? If it was played immediately, actually white can put pressure, but black can kind of parry it and reach this sort of position, which might not be enough. And you see that white's committed his pawn on h5. Magnus's move is more subtle. It keeps some options open with this by trying to get black to fix the pawn on h5 to stop h5, because it starts to be dangerous now, this idea of taking an h5 and knight g4 when black's not ready for all this pressure on e5 here. So the threat is stronger than the execution. It's like a Nimzovich move. The threat is stronger than the execution of h5 here. It's keeping that threat and making it a bit strong potentially. So black commits to h5 just to stop white playing h5, followed by potentially knight g4. So we have now, instead, now that's being committed there, we see knight f1, damage done. Knight f1, king f8, knight d2. So a bit of maneuvering here. The king comes towards the center to try, and primary task is to help e5 pawn there. So white's potentially doubling now. On e5, knight f3. Going into that lovely g5 square. Another perk of getting black to play this h5 is that the g5 square is more vulnerable. Knight cooking into g5. Then we have this doubling. So again, the threat's stronger than the execution. There's no point taking at the moment if it's not doing anything. Black doubles defensively, so we have an interesting position here. And you might ordinarily think, isn't black solid enough here? There's an equilibrium. This knight's actually more aggressive though than this one. And in fact, with the absence, with this pawn being committed here, this is a beautiful knight outpost actually. If the knight ever got to g4, there's always f3. There's just no way of kicking this knight. But okay, so the knight actually goes back though for a moment. Knight h8, and now we see the point of this knight going back. It's actually supporting d4, and white is actively undoubling black's pawns to translate this into a more exploitable form of weakness, which is more abstract, actually a spatial advantage. Immediately threatening to win the pawn, so e takes, and we see knight takes d4, and black cannot reply with either e5 or c5. On e5 we have knight f5 check, winning the exchange, and on c5 it's equally disastrous after check, believe it or not. Rook d1, this is really bad for black. If king c6, takes, and there's a great resource knight a7 check in this line, which, because of this pawn and this configuration, it's terrible for black. On king d6, sorry, on king b6, we take here and we fork the king and rook. Yeah. On king d6, we can take here and win the rook like that. Yeah. So this is actually bad news for black, this variation, if c5 is played. So we see actually g6 being played. So it looks as though this pesky knight's just allowed, but at least the f5 square has been stopped, so maybe e5 soon. Rook e3, but black doesn't indulge in e5 even now with the f5 square covered. He actually plays knight f7. Sergey plays knight f7. Now e5, it looks a little bit tempting, but if we look at this scenario, a5 picked on, and if that's defended, rook d1, we see actually the pawns, even though they've been undoubled, but it creates kind of more exploitable weaknesses now, because actually we can target e5 like this and try and isolate that d pawn, and white can end up in a scenario which is actually very pleasant like this, where white stands better. So maybe black wasn't too enamored to play e5 in here, even though he seems to have supported it by extinguishing knight f5. He actually played knight f7, and we have this permission to play e5, gaining space. The question is this enough, this space advantage? Well, one perk, it offers hooks into these squares, and it's this hook in particular that's made use of. Rook f3, let's go into that f6 square, start probing black. Knight h6, rook f6, rook g7, but it's sufficient to defend for the moment. Now white wants to play on the other side with b4 and strengthen his grip on some dark squares over here, and you see that this strengthening of grip on the dark squares on both sides of the board, it's beautiful. It's poetry, this game, actually. So far, you see that these pawns are on light squares, and white's dark square play on both sides of the board is evident. Trying to get a grip on these two dark squares now, and we see that by force, basically. After a takes, it's virtually forced. The reason is if b6, white can take here and very quickly play rook b1, and black can't handle this, because if king c7, because of that infiltration over here, then we have just rook takes e6. So there's no way of handling both sides. The rooks are really troublemakers, both of them here, with this knight perched in the center like a happy parrot. So yeah, it's that would be a killer to allow this position, basically. On rook c8, then we just have check. Sorry, on rook c8 we have check, and we pick up everything. So yeah, after b4, black's hand is forced. He has to take, virtually forced, and allow this horrible position where white's getting a stranglehold on these dark squares over here. So it's poetry in motion, this at the moment. Rook f3, knight h6, a5, getting a grip on this side of the board. It's no wonder Magnus has Michael Adams as a second, because he's also famous for strangulating opponents on both sides of the board, fixing down pawns everywhere. So all the pawns are kind of fixed. You see these pawns here and here, they're all fixed. So the dark square grip everywhere. Knight f5, knight b3, going into another destination outpost square. King c7, knight c5, not worrying about knight d4 at the moment. Rook, king b8, rook b1, but at the knight on d4 is a resource. You can imagine if b5 too early, then it's going to fork both rooks, so that's got to be taken care of. So king a7, b5 is not possible here because of this knight coming in. So we have rook d3 covering that d4 square from the naughty f5 knight. We have rook c7, and now yeah, this dissuades, of course, b5 here. So b5's got to be exactly the right time. Now, what do we mean by exactly the right time? It means at time with maximum advantage to yourself and minimal advantage to the opponent. That's not here. So rook a3, knight d4, and it seems to be some aimless, mindless shuffling. But now there is a grand vision, it seems. And this is just poetic, really. There's a pawn here, and you think the b5 break is associated with that pawn. And note there's a pawn here, which also has a g4 break associated with it, if only that was possible. King h3 makes this idea possible. And you might think, well, what's the point of that? Well, one point clearly, if ever this, then we get an f file to play with. As well, we can actually double rooks quite easily on this f file and infiltrate, as well as kicking the knight to an inferior square. So this is all starting to prepare f3 and g4. So it's beautiful that these two breaks are implied by the fixed pawns, and this was purposely like put there, you know, from the threat is stronger than the execution moves earlier. This one, so but this one, the break of g4 is actually making sure we get the right time for b5. So it's working very carefully, a coordinated kind of attack on both sides of the board. But the name of the game here is to make b5 find the most effective moment possible. Black plays knight h6. We have f3, rook f7, rook d4, knight f5. It seems some aimless shuffling, right? Rook h7, which dissuades, of course, g4. Because we're on h4 here. Rook b3, as though b5 is on the cards again. Black gears up like this. So we have this position. And you might think, well, with this position, it's surely b5 here. By the way, if rook c7, we could try g4 here. And it would be a mistake for black to take this, because then we do just get the f file. We can just march down the f file and back to our old f6 outpost with advantage. But maybe just knight, so knight h6 would have to be considered. This position is interesting, and then maybe b5 soon over here. At least this knight's in a more passive square. But white's, you know, got the advantage there on rook c7. But okay, so rook e7. But again, b5 is not played at this moment. So take a snapshot of this position and have a look where b5 isn't played. It seems quite optimal to play it here. But actually we see rook d3, patience, rook h8, rook b1. And it's at this moment, rook h7, that it's here Magnus chooses b5. This position. Didn't we just have this identical position? So this is at move 57 where Magnus plays b5. How is this more effective than earlier? Let's just step back again. We had this similar position on move 54, rook e to e7. We had a rook on b3, a rook on d2, and a knight here. And Magnus chooses this position. Switch again. Sorry, earlier b5 wasn't so tempting. Rook on b3 covering e3, rook on d2 covering d4. So that wasn't as tempting as this position. The rook's at the same place, right? This is a mystery, is it? Why here? You see, there's a torturous secret buried in this game. Why would you get rid of the torture session here rather than earlier? This is a big torture guru mystery to solve here. It seems b5 is more effective in this position. And let me just put an engine evaluation here. Okay, b5 here is given as 1.41. This is Houdini. 1.41. So at move 54 on this one, b5 here. Let's look at the proof in the end, in the evaluation. In the variation takes, black was playing knight e3, coming to c4 maybe. This position isn't so bad. Sorry, that rook has to move. It isn't so bad. It's an advantage for white, but it isn't so bad. So we get that line, but here after b5 it's much clearer. There isn't a knight popping into e3 basically. That's the difference. That's the subtle difference. Or d4, the rook is simultaneously coping with this pesky knight. So yeah, this is the right moment. Black in fact might have made a terrible slip up here. It looks identical but it's not, because of this knight not being allowed in. Black perhaps should have geared up for b5 by playing differently here with rook f8, because at least the rook can come to the c file here. So if b5 here, it's again a little bit less effective, because then we have the rook able to use at least c8 even if the knight can't do anything. So it's working out the beneficiaries of the b5 break and making sure you get the right moment where you minimize the opponent's beneficiaries, and the opponent by contrast has to make sure that they can stand to benefit in the maximum way if b5 is played. So it's very, very instructive, this, for both sides, how almost identical looking position. Actually the knight, it's the knight benefiting or not benefiting here, which means actually the rook has to stay a little bit more active. Sorry, in this position, this rook cannot go there, it cannot afford that. It needs to hang around for this b5. So it seems rook c8 is one way, or knight h6. And I think this was mentioned in the post-mortem, and I think Magnus felt it was almost like a zugzwang position, but actually this technically is much more tenable here. If we have b5 here, again, you know, there's a beneficiary. This rook is benefiting from this b5 break, and this is actually given as equal by engines. You see, it's not so bad. And the knight's even threatening knight d4 here. So yeah, this was a bad moment because b5 is non-controversial basically. There's hardly any beneficiaries for black on b5. White benefits because he's opening up possibilities now to hit these guys, especially from this point of b6. So we have c takes, rook takes. White's benefited greatly, and engine has like plus 1.5 here already, as if this is a very promising position which could lead to a win. d4 is played. If rook h8, rook b6, we see that pivot square, brilliant square, for double attacking these two guys. And here g4, and then here black's defense is broken. It's just broken down. So rook h8 is insufficient, and also rook c7 isn't good. Knight takes e6. So we see d4. Yeah, it's pretty desperate to play. You have to play reduce to d4, and now rook b6. But black has an idea which seems very, very cunning, to come in like this to try and get this pawn down. But Magnus plays just simply knight f4 here, protecting the rook, and now rook h c7, and there's two possibilities. This looks like this pawn could be taken, and it might be okay. It might be a bit scary that this could be taken and the rook comes down, but it's possible to do rook takes g6. It's a good position for white. Magnus chose instead of move 62 knight d5, which is another way of playing it with advantage. But rook takes g6 is also very promising here on taking rook c3, trying to drag this pawn down like in the previous game, which helped Karjakin draw. But This position is a bit different because actually it's very tricky for black. This position here after knight f4, for example, if we look at this, if rook takes f3, knight d5 is actually a very big advantage. Yeah, that's decisive. It's we can actually take here and we're queening the f pawn in this line. So, and if rook e3, white is better here, e6, going in with rook f7 soon, and it's white's pawn that's actually more significant than black's. Rook f8, rook here, taking, yeah, and white's left with a dangerous e6 pawn. So this was a way of, it seems this was winning rook takes g6 potentially, but we see knight d5, and this pushes the borders of rook and pawn endings now, if white can win this or not, because one pair of rooks is coming off. But the idea is now check to move the king to an awkward place where a6 is sometimes dangerous. For example, on king b8, a6, that's the idea, as well as taking and coming back for a mating net. So it does seem very, very dangerous. These three guys are going to do an assassination job on black's king here if black's not careful. The king runs for its life. King b8, knight b5, so threatening a6, and the king runs again to c8, avoiding a6. Yeah, it's very, very dangerous, this position, to allow a6. There's no time to take on f3 or anything. Yeah, because a6 is on the cards. We see king c8. Let's just show 100% that. Yeah, a6 here. It doesn't matter about losing g3. This position is just in fact, we use this pawn here as well, e6. Sorry, it's king c8, e6. Knight e7, just to show you this for a moment. e7. Yeah, and black would have to give up the knight and it crumbles. So anyway, king c8, yeah, there's justification for the king to move out. Now rook takes g6, rook takes f3, king g2, rook b3, and now further simplification, the knights come off. So we have this rook and pawn ending. White has to be very careful this doesn't go in some sort of theoretical draw. Rook e3 was played. If king c7, you might think this is clever to try and get the rook to double attack here. So we'll have a quick look at this. Rook takes d4, rook b5. Here, actually, white, I think, is pushing for a win even in this endgame scenario. This is going to be winning for white. Yeah, this sort of position, it's too passive. Yeah, that's an example on rook takes d4. Sorry, on king c7, that's an example. But rook e3 was played here, and actually white isn't so keen to allow this scenario of black taking on e5, because it could be really tricky. If we have this position, it is actually much more tricky, and potentially this is a draw, this kind of scenario here. If this is allowed, white actually improves things significantly by playing e6. He wants to be able to gain control of this fifth rank himself. We see king c7, rook takes d4. White's the first rook to the fifth rank now, so this consigns the black rook into greater passivity, which is a golden thing to do quite often in rook and pawn endings, to have more active rook, to keep your rooks active. Now the rook's tied down to passivity on h6, and this now is a much clearer winning procedure for white. The white king just marches up the board and even sidesteps a check now on g8 by playing king f6 to get to g7 this way, to sidestep rook g8 check. But even the position's so good that even this, yeah, I believe might be winning this position. Even if it went like this, this is just winning, because what happens when we get this scenario, we build a bridge there, yeah, and it's enough time to catch black's pawn. So even that, but even more accurate was just king f6 played. So king f6, avoiding losing the g pawn, and it's clear it's hopeless here. Black's rook is so passive. This is not one of those drawing rook and pawn endings. Sergey resigned. By the way, I have no definite favoritism. Don't judge by the length of my analysis. I am going to revisit Sergey's win with deeper analysis as top priority earlier in the match. The reason I was a bit under the weather that day with time constraints. I know this video has been produced a bit later in the day than usual because of other factors, but I hope you've enjoyed this more comprehensive analysis. I believe I was always wondering, when should you do more analysis? I think the more interesting games of chess deserve more analysis, and for the punters that's often with the decisive results. So I believe that there is more of a lust for a deeper analysis of these games and how they work, so we can all learn from them as well to produce decisive results ourselves. But yeah, it was magnificent how, let's look at in a nutshell, how the b5 break, the effectiveness was absolutely maximized. I think the beneficiaries for both sides were identified, that the right moment was found where b5 seemed to be a little bit more effective than before. So even with the most resourceful play, so the patience against a very, very resourceful defender, one of the best in the world, Sergey Karjakin, if you find the right moments even against the best defenders, then that's the right moment for this breakthrough, a breakthrough type move. But the way both sides of the boards were used, I think that's kind of very artistic as well. So although there is a great sporting and competitive element to this game and the context, I think it's a great game in its own right for highlighting this sort of play against weaknesses on, playing on both sides of the board. And basically, yeah, how you prepare a pawn breakthrough and how beautiful it is, the logic behind this kind of stuff when played so effectively by Magnus Carlsen. So comments, questions, likes appreciated. Thanks very much. And of course the match is on now. We're all equal with 2 games to go. Very exciting match now. Thanks again. Cheers.